I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we unpack what happened in Romania over the weekend, where a Russian drone flew into its airspace for almost an hour. And we look at the fallout responses from Nato and Europe since last week's similar incursion in Poland. Meanwhile, in Russia, Ukrainian saboteurs derailed 2 trains over the weekend. Finally, we discuss Russia's economy and oil industry and zoom in on India and whether, as Trump put it a few weeks ago, it is indeed lost to deepest, darkest China.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 15th of September. 3 years and 205 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Associate Defense Editor Dom Nicholls and contributing editor Dia Chakravarty. But first, let's go to Dom for the military updates.
Thanks, Adélie. Hello, everyone. Hello, dear. So let's start almost pseudo-politically, because the big story over the weekend, started Friday, actually, just after we finished, was from NATO. So on Friday, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, alongside Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Alexis Grinkovich, held a joint press conference to outline NATO's response to that violation last week of Polish airspace by the Russian drones 2 days earlier. So it was overnight, Wednesday, Thursday, I think, which we think, I'm now told, up to 24. Which obviously covers a whole load of numbers, but we think around 24 drones through Polish airspace last week. So on Friday, Mr. Rutte announced the launch of Operation Eastern Sentry, NATO's new mission, a military activity aimed to bolster NATO's posture along what they're still calling NATO's eastern flank, but I really wish they would call it the front line. It's a small thing, but it focuses the mindset, I think. Anyway, NATO Secretary-General said, so on Friday at the press conference, he said, "Today we announced the launch of Eastern Sentry to bolster our posture even further along our eastern flank. The military activity will involve a range of assets from allies. Eastern Sentry will make clear that NATO is always ready to defend." He said it's going to add flexibility and strength to our posture and make clear that as a defensive alliance, we are always ready to defend. So unless you missed the point, he kept saying about defend, but doing extra stuff. Then, in a statement, Allied Command Operations, that's the bit of NATO responsible for the planning and execution of operations. They're based out of Shape. Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe is about 50, 60 k's southwest of Brussels. So ACO, the Allied Command Operations, in a statement said, the multi-domain activity, clunky phrase, just means land, sea, air, space, cyber, all the rest of it. The multi-domain activity, which will commence in the coming days and continue for an undisclosed amount of time, is in response to ongoing airspace violations, including the numerous Russian drones that violated Poland's airspace on September the 10th. The alliance already responded quickly and decisively to that situation, demonstrating NATO capability and resolve to defend the alliance, but will now act further to strengthen its posture. Referring specifically to that drone incursion of Polish airspace, SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, said whilst a full assessment of the incident is ongoing, NATO is not waiting, we are acting. He said allies have already begun to announce the deployment of forces and capabilities for Eastern Sentry. Denmark will contribute 2 F-16s and an anti-air warfare frigate. France will contribute 3 Rafales. Those are fighter jets as well. Germany will contribute 4 Eurofighters. The United Kingdom has also expressed its willingness to support. These forces and more will reinforce existing Allied forces and enhance NATO's deterrence and defensive posture where and when needed. So that was all very good on Friday. But as for the where and when it was needed, we only had to wait about 24 hours because on Saturday, a drone flew through Romanian airspace unmolested. Romanian Foreign Minister Arnautoiu said that the Romanian Air Force had intercepted a Russian drone near the Danube, the river. She said 2 F-16s from the 86th Air Base tracked it for 50 minutes, 50 minutes, until it left Romanian airspace. No casualties or damage were reported. So on Twitter, Ms. Toiu said, Romanian Air Force intercepted a Russian drone violating our national airspace near the Danube. 2 F-16s from the 86th Air Base tracked it until it left our airspace without causing any damage or casualties. 50 minutes later, 2 Allied German Eurofighters were also ready in the air monitoring the situation. People in Romania were never in danger, but such actions by Russia are unacceptable and reckless. And then Romania's Defence Minister, Iulianu, said the Russian drone penetrated about 10 kilometres and remained over NATO territory for nearly 50 minutes before turning back. Mr. Moșteanu said that under the law, the army has the right to take down such targets. He said the pilots had full authorisation to open fire if necessary. Romania's MOD said the F-16 pilots, quote, assessed the collateral risks and decided not to open fire. So the drone flew through Romanian airspace for about 50 minutes, tracked and indeed followed by Romanian fighter jets, and was not brought down. It made its merry way back into Ukraine. President Zelensky has criticised NATO for not shooting down the drone. He said it was a provocation that should have been immediately met and not just monitored. He said, do not wait for dozens of Shaheds and ballistic missiles before finally making decisions. He added the incursion into Romania marked what he said was an obvious expansion of the war by Russia and was not the result of a mistake. Writing on Twitter, he said there are no minor military threats from those who are accustomed to destroying the independence and lives of others. Kaja Kallas, the Vice President of the European Commission, said the Romanian airspace violation was, quote, yet another unacceptable breach of an EU member state's sovereignty. Yet another unacceptable breach of an EU member state's sovereignty. Okay, so that's the news. Here's my ranty comments, so apologies. Except that it is acceptable, isn't it? We did accept it. It was accepted. NATO, in terms of deterrence posture against Russia, already has the Baltic Air Policing Mission, already has the enhanced forward presence up and down the eastern flank, the front line, whatever you want to call it. Britain's got a battalion of armoured infantry soldiers in Estonia right now. Other allied forces have got troops up and down the alliance. So Baltic Air Policing, enhanced forward presence. We've now got Operation Eastern Sentry. A number of points to think about is how much is it going to cost? How much is Eastern Sentry going to cost? And would that money or the military capability have been better used instead if it had been given to Ukraine 3 years ago? If it had, would all these NATO missions be necessary? Did all these missions collectively fail to deter Russia? Evidently, yes. But if we just respond to this latest Russian provocation or test, we're going to bankrupt ourselves. There's no point in playing strategic whack-a-mole, waiting to see what Russia does and then launching an operation to counter it. Russia is always going to find a way to poke somewhere we've not covered. I think we need to make it clear to Putin when weighing up any potential action that the cost of that action is going to outweigh any potential benefit. Right now, he's clearly judging that the risk to do these things, and if NATO jets are going to do nothing but observe a drone until it safely leaves NATO airspace and heads back to Ukraine where it can explode without any risk to NATO citizens, is he wrong to think that NATO is as deterrent a posture as they would wish? Anyway, enough of the ranting. Apologies. We are going to hear a lot more about this, I'm sure. Elsewhere, in terms of news, a relatively quiet weekend, maybe because there was the YES conference, the Yalta European Security Conference in Kyiv, attended by a number of foreign dignitaries. Not that that's ever really stopped Russia before, but Keith Kellogg was there. President Zelensky called him, he said he's like a human Patriot missile. When he's in town, Russia seems not to fire at the capital. So the YES conference was happening. Also, Prince Harry was buzzing around in Ukraine. But for whatever reason, it was a relatively quiet weekend. I'll come on to the last 24 hours in a moment. There was a blast on railway infrastructure in Kyiv Oblast. It was damaged by explosions overnight, Saturday, Sunday, following what authorities said was the detonation of munitions. International and regional trains across Ukraine were delayed and rerouted, but authorities said the explosions were not linked to a Russian attack, rather that it had been the detonations of munitions on a train carrying military supplies. Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko said the explosions occurred about 20 km south of Kyiv, near the town of Boyarka. No casualties reported there. But then just around the weekend, of the last 24 hours, Ukraine's Air Force said that Russian forces had launched 84 Shahed-type attack and decoy drones and 3 S-300 missiles overnight Sunday, Monday. Air defences intercepted 59 drones, but 22 others and 3 missiles got through, hitting 13 locations, killing 5, injuring nearly 50. Into Russia then, and we're told a second tanker, as in the maritime tanker ship, had suffered damage due to that Ukrainian drone attack on the port of Primorsk, northwest up the coast from St. Petersburg last Thursday. We knew one had been hit and some port infrastructure. We now think a second vessel had been struck. A loading terminal in the port was also damaged, we're told, which caused operations to be briefly suspended. Now, Phillips O'Brien of St Andrews University, he said in his latest weekend updates out today, I think it may have come out last night, he said, even if Russia can pump and refine oil, if it can't ship it out to customers, it's of little value. So destroying the means of distribution is in many ways as good, if not better, than destroying the means of production. President Zelensky said yesterday that Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil facilities amount to the most effective sanctions, weakening Russia's ability to finance its war. He said they have significantly curbed the Russian oil industry, which curbs the war. It's worth noting oil exports are thought to constitute about a third of Russia's federal budget, making them a critical source of funding for the Kremlin, which is why Ukraine's long-range campaign continues. On Friday, just after we produced the show, Ukrainian drones struck 2 facilities at the Ufa oil refinery in the Bashkortostan region of Russia. That's about 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow. And just a little bit north of that, the next region north, on Saturday, another Ukrainian drone attack hit the Metrofax chemicals plant in Russia's Perm-Krai region, as I said, about 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow. I spoke to a Western official on Friday after we'd produced the podcast. I asked him about what's Ukraine's theory of victory? How are they going to win this thing? And he said it was three-pronged, basically, as far as he was aware. Number one, just hold on in Ukraine. Ukrainian troops are fighting valiantly in Ukraine, but they are, as we report, generally going backwards very slowly. But that's the pattern in recent months. But hold on inside Ukraine, build the international political consensus outside, and relentlessly go after Russia's oil and gas sector. So make no mistake, this is a campaign, this is a strategy that Ukraine is laying down upon Russia. These long-range strikes, they are not prioritizing military headquarters, really, or even the production facilities, and certainly not civilian targets, as the Russians do, but they are very deliberately and increasingly effectively going for the fuel. It's being felt so far in the far-flung regions of Russia. You'll see on social media loads of imagery of these long lines of people queuing up to fill up their cars and what have you. So it's slowly encroaching on Moscow and St. Petersburg. But that impact is going to be felt more keenly, especially as winter starts to bite. So that campaign of Ukraine's is having effect. Now, still in Russia, and Ukrainian saboteurs derailed 2 trains in western Russia, killing 3 soldiers over the weekend. One train was said to come off its tracks close to St. Petersburg, not far from the borders with Estonia and Finland, hundreds of miles away from Ukraine. We're told the driver was killed there. Then another freight train carrying empty fuel tanks was derailed in a similar area. The derailments followed an explosion on a section of rail track in Russia's Western Oriel region late on Saturday, said to have killed 3 members of the National Guard. The Ukrainian military source said on Sunday that Kyiv was behind the coordinated attacks. Sources told the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence department, and the Special Operations Forces said that they had carried out a uniquely complex operation halting traffic on the railway line. The source said these railway lines are critical supply routes for Russian forces operating in the Kharkiv and Sumy directions. Now, the Russian soldiers were apparently killed while examining an explosive device found during checks on the railway tracks, according to Andrei Klitschkov, who's Russian Oriel Oblast governor. A specialist unit was sent to the site, but an explosion went off during demining, killing 2 of the soldiers instantly, injuring a 3rd who later died in hospital. We've reported for months how Ukrainian forces and pro-Ukrainian support groups have repeatedly targeted Russian railway and energy networks through sabotage operations. Still in Russia, and again with who, Ukraine's military intelligence carried out a cyber revenge hack, we are told, on the Russian Central Election Commission yesterday, in response to elections being held in places including occupied Ukrainian territories. This is an HOR source speaking to the Kyiv Independent. Their story is running today. So this attack coincided with Russia's Unified Voting Day, which apparently includes elections for 21 governors, deputies of 11 regional assemblies, and around 47,000 municipal leaders. Voting was also staged in illegally annexed Ukrainian territories, including direct regional head elections in Sevastopol in occupied Crimea. So the Russia's CEC, the Central Election Commission chief, Elia Pamfilova, acknowledged that a major hack attack had occurred against the commission resources yesterday, saying the internet was down in the headquarters. The HOR source said that it was a DDoS attack, a direct denial of service attack, targeting the Central Election Commission servers, Russia's electronic voting platform, and the state digital services portal. The sources said the goal was to disrupt online voting, particularly in occupied Ukrainian regions. We're told digital services were paralyzed for quite some time, leaving Russians unable to vote, especially in mayoral and gubernatorial races, the source claimed. Russia's CEC later reported an overall turnout of about 47%, meaning about 26 million voters. A couple on the sort of military political front, just to bring you, Adélie, the Danish government intends to disregard over 20 laws and regulations in order to build a Ukrainian weapons factory in Denmark. This comes from the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, the public service media company of Denmark. They say the government there aims to give itself far-reaching powers to override other laws, regulations, and even citizens' rights to complain if a project serves essential national defence goals or civil emergency purposes. They intend to use this power to allow the Ukrainian company Firepoint, maker of the Flamingo cruise missile, to build a solid rocket fuel plant. We're told more than 20 different rules and laws will be specifically disregarded so that the factory near Skridstrup Air Base can get up and running as quickly as possible. This potential action is contained in a draft executive order that the Danish Business Authority has sent out for consultation. The law is intended to ensure that the authorities, quote, have the necessary options to quickly implement specific construction projects and operational activity that serve essential national defence purposes or essential civil emergency purposes. This law, if enacted, will allow the government to deviate from other legislation if it deems necessary. For example, the Environmental Act, the Planning Act, and the Nature Protection Act. They can all be disregarded if a new weapons factory is needed to be built under this law. It's got a sunset clause. It means it's going to be repealed at the end of 2028. I thought that was quite interesting. And I note that it was reflected in a speech this morning, just in the last couple of hours, by Britain's outgoing Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin. He was speaking a couple of hours ago in his last speech for a while. He said he's going to go dark now. We're not going to hear a huge amount from him whilst he supports his successor. He made that very point, saying we should look at planning rules. He said, where and how quickly are the 6 ammunition factories? They're the ones announced under the recent Strategic Defence Review here in Britain. Where and how quickly are the 6 ammunition factories going to be built? Are government profit rates high enough for the cost of capital to attract investment? He's saying that we might have to adjust procurement and competition legislation where the rules are working against the outcome. He said it's the same with ESG rules. There has to be something profoundly wrong, he says, when UK pension funds struggle to invest in UK defence, but international pension funds do. What is it that we're trying to achieve? So there does seem to be a bit of a pushback against some of the environmental and planning rules that we've been working under for a number of years here across Europe in the aim of re-equipping and rearming. And just finally, some news from Capitol Hill in Washington. 2 important votes occurred late last week. First, Marjorie Taylor Greene's amendment to prohibit funds for Ukraine in the fiscal year 2026 National Defence Authorization Act failed by a vote of 60 to 372. And then secondly, an amendment to authorise the continuation of the Baltic Security Initiative passed by a voice vote. A voice vote is where they just call for all the yeas and the nays, so not specifically counted unless it's a particularly close vote. The context of this is the news that the US, as we've been reporting, is expected to phase out security assistance programs for some European nations. That's funds for training and equipment, that kind of stuff. The Pentagon program, which falls under an authority known as Section 333. But funds for that have already been approved through to the end of September next year, but any more must be agreed by Congress. And the Trump administration has not yet started any work to request more money. They've, in fact, indicated that they're not going to. So thought that this is all part of the plan by the Pentagon Policy Chief Elbridge Colby to shift US defence resources to the Indo-Pacific. So the Baltic Security Initiative is connected to that, but slightly separate. It was specifically set up in 2020 to aid the armed forces of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Now, to date, the White House has not sought further funding for that programme, but the vote on Thursday last week, I think it was Thursday, maybe in late Wednesday, codifies into law that the Baltic Security Initiative, provided it makes it into the National Defence Authorization Act later this year unmolested, will continue. So this amendment was put forward by Austin Scott. He's the Republican congressman representing Georgia's 8th congressional district. It doesn't say anything about how much money is involved, nor would it. That's a decision for Congress. But last year, Congress approved $228 million for this. However, it did contain the clause saying the Secretary of Defence should seek to require matching funds from each of the Baltic countries that participate in the initiative in amounts commensurate with amounts provided by the Department of Defence for the initiative. So I think they've got to match the funding. I don't know if that's what they have done each year for the last 5 years. If anyone knows any different, please do let me know, because I wonder if that is going to be a potential stumbling block. But interesting to see that for all the direction of travel, shall we say, from the administration, there are votes going through Congress that obviously and legally support Ukraine. Bit of a download there, I'm afraid, Adélie, but that's what always happens on a Monday. That's us up to date.
Thank you, Dom. I feel like you've had quite a monologue just now. I'm not going to come back onto the drone incursion over Romania because you've covered this quite thoroughly. So just some quick political and diplomatic updates for us. Yesterday, on Sunday, Trump said that a meeting between Zelensky and Putin was very unlikely indeed because of a deep personal animosity. I feel like a lot of us could have guessed that. He said, the hatred between Zelensky and Putin is unfathomable. I think I'm going to have to do all of the talking. They hate each other so much, they almost can't talk. I see you raising your eyebrows there, Dom. We've heard over and over the last few weeks, Zelensky calling for a meeting with President Putin. Putin has repeatedly refused to meet Zelensky in person. And although the news on this has kept on going back and forth, it really feels like it's nowhere near to happen. And with that, prospects of potential ceasefire and peace talks. Also on the drone incursions in Poland and Romania from last week and over the weekend, the Kyiv ND had a really interesting interview over the weekend with the Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, who said he was optimistic about NATO's response and how things have played out since the incursion. He said, I think Russia lost this confrontation. When asked if people are dying on the Rzeszów airport, which is a key logistic hub for Allied support for Ukraine, would reach the threshold for triggering Article 5, Sikorski agreed and added, which Russia is coming dangerously towards. Some media are speculating that the trajectory of some of the drones was towards Rzeszów airport, the main airport through which equipment to Ukraine gets through. Our first duty is to protect the hub from Russian sabotage, from Russian espionage, and from Russian kinetic attacks. And we are in charge of managing this complex logistical operation. According to the Polish ministry, talks are currently underway between Poland and Ukraine on deeper cooperation regarding drone and anti-drone systems, and that's including electronic warfare. Sikorski added that the public now demands correctly closer collaboration with Ukraine because they have the latest, most relevant experience and the latest weapons for dealing with Russian drone. And therefore, the result of the last week, and we're going to have to see what happens with Romania, is that yes, Putin may have sped up Polish-Ukrainian collaboration in weapons production, according to Sikorski. I want to stay with the Kyiv ND and its reporting, but go to Russia and its economy, because the Kyiv ND has got a story of a recent clash between Vladimir Putin and the head of Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, its CEO, German Gref, which shows an increasing disconnect between the Kremlin and Russia's economic community, as Russia's GDP growth has slowed to near zero in July and August. That downturn underscores the limits of Russia's war-fueled expansion, which is driven by record defense spending but hampered by weak private consumption and shrinking civilian investment. So just to put that into perspective, in 2025, the defense spending in Russia reached 7.2% of GDP. That is the highest since the end of the Cold War. The International Monetary Fund has already cut its 2025 growth forecast for Russia to 0.9%, down from 4.3% last year. That is the steepest downgrade amongst major economies. Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank chief, said in June that Russia had reached the edge of capacity, while Economic Minister Maxim Rechnikov said the country was on the verge of a transition into recession. Now, what does that mean in terms of Russian public opinion? A June poll by the independent Russian pollster Levada Center found that 58% of Russians named rising prices as their top concern, while just 33% cited the war against Ukraine. And to wrap up the updates, still on economic updates, I just want to have a word on the global oil prices, which rose as a result of the many Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian energy sector over the last few months and weeks, and especially the last week. The global oil prices rose this morning as Ukrainian drone strikes continued to hit Russian oil refineries. Just a quick recap. Over the past week, the Ukrainian forces have struck various refineries and energy facilities that include Krasnodar Krai, Russia's largest oil loading port on the Baltic Sea, a major refinery in Bashkortostan, and the Kurishi refinery in Leningrad Oblast. Kurishi, which is one of Russia's largest refineries, processes more than 17 million tons of crude annually. And as Dom mentioned in his updates, Zelensky said it was the most effective of sanctions, and they have significantly curbed the Russian oil industry, which, as a result, curbs the war. The oil exports constitute 1/3 of Russia's federal budget, and that makes them a critical source of funding for the war in Ukraine. Which brings me to our guest today, Dia Chakravarty, who's a contributing editor at The Telegraph. Dia, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And the oil subject brings me to India, because that's what we're going to talk about today. We wanted to have you in the studio so we could discuss what's been happening with India lately and how that changes the political and diplomatic scene on the global scale. And obviously tariffs imposed by the US onto India, because secondary sanctions is very important in that picture. So we've seen Modi hold hands with President Putin, smiling and laughing with President Xi Jinping at the summit in Tianjin. As I've just mentioned, the tariffs hike as secondary sanctions. So let's try to unpack all of this. Can you walk us through what's at stake for India in attending that meeting? And is Modi indeed signaling to the West that he's looking for allies elsewhere?
I think part of it would certainly be that Modi trying to signal to the West that India is not alone. India and Russia has long since had a very deep connection, culturally, politically, of course, because if you remember, India was very much part of the USSR bloc during the Cold War era. And I think until very recently, Russia still remains the biggest single source of arms for India, even though India has diversified recently. As of, I think, between 2020 and 2024, 36% of India's arms were supplied by Russia, a huge chunk still. So the deep connections still remain. There's a very deep cultural connection as well. The current chief minister of Tamil Nadu, which is a very important state in India, is called MK Stalin. That's how deep the cultural ties go. There's a sort of slightly humorous anecdote, if you like. In 1968, the state of West Bengal, that was ruled by the Communist Party at the time, actually very pointedly changed the name of the street where the US Consulate General was situated from Harrington Street to Ho Chi Minh Street. These sort of conflicts, if you like, have been going on with the West for a long time. That seemed to change when Modi came to power. And Modi, not suddenly, this has been going on for a little while, but quite conclusively, Modi seemed to forge a relationship with the West through his relationship, a personal friendship, if you like, with President Trump. But then suddenly that seemed to have gone a little bit sour, maybe, when President Trump declared, I think it was the 1st of September, wasn't it, on Truth, or maybe the 5th of September, when he declared on Truth Social, we have lost India and Russia to China. So why is that? Why has that happened? So our sources that we have in the Foreign Office seem to think that President Trump has suddenly realized that there isn't much to be gained from India as a market. So the products, what America can offer in terms of the goods and services to sell to India, it's a pretty small market. So perhaps President Trump has realized that, or President Trump has considered that he doesn't need to keep India in hand anymore. But India needs to signify to the world that it is not alone. It is surrounded by China, which I think India claims currently occupies 38,000 square kilometers of its land, of India's land, according to India. It's surrounded by Pakistan, which has always, the relationship between India and Pakistan since the inception of both the countries in 1947 has been extremely hostile. And then you have China in the mix, which between 2022 and 24 supplied 81% of Pakistan's weaponry, arms. So in effect, you're seeing a sort of a proxy war going on. But then you've also got the summit where Russia, China are coming together and signaling to the West that actually outside of West, we have all these alliances going. So it's all very interesting, but also very confusing.
It is very confusing indeed. You said that relationships between India and China had been fraught for a long time. And as you said, China is arming Pakistan. Does India have anything to fear from China realistically? And is India trying to keep China happy by keeping Russia happy?
The diplomats that you speak to in India, they would tell you that India is very pragmatic. They're trying to find a pragmatic solution, the least bad solution. But if you look at it from the West's point of view, if you look at China's military capabilities compared to India's military capabilities, India doesn't really stand a chance, does it? India does need either Russia with it, and I don't think even that's going to be enough. If India is to properly stand up to China, it needs the West behind it. Now, India doesn't know whether it has a reliable ally in the West because of history, because of what India would call West's, affection towards Pakistan, for example, because partly Pakistan has been armed by the US as well, by the West. So for all those reasons, India does need the West. Now, if President Trump has suddenly decided that the West doesn't need India, then I think that is a problem for India. So in that case, it will have to come up with pragmatic solutions. And that might actually mean going and meeting with President Xi, with President Putin, and trying to signal to the West that actually, if you don't back us, we might forge a different kind of alliance here.
So obviously the secondary sanctions and the hike in tariffs has deeply impacted India and its ability to buy Russian oil, although it still is, because it was reported at the beginning of September that actually it was going to continue and increase its buying of Russian oil despite the secondary sanctions and the hike in tariffs. What is the general understanding and the public opinion on, one, the war in Ukraine, but also on these tariffs? Do they feel particularly unfair in India?
So the war in Ukraine is actually quite important to India because India buys a lot of its fertilizers from Ukraine. And I think about 58% of Indian population relies on agriculture for their livelihoods. So it's very important. So it's not really, as far as India is concerned, a war going on in the West that doesn't affect them at all. The tariffs do seem to Indians as unfair. To Prime Minister Modi's opponents, it's a little bit of a stick to poke Prime Minister Modi, where it's saying, there you were trying to forge a relationship with perhaps a very unreliable man, President Trump, and now look how you've been repaid. So actually, we should probably go back to our former partners, who historically has been Russia, definitely not the West. So where do you stand there? So yes, there is that element of feeling all this is deeply unfair. On the issue of the tariffs, it seems like India is understandably a little bit baffled because while India is looking at about 50% tariffs, if the West is saying that India is being punished for buying oil from Russia and China, Russia's greater ally, China, has, I think India's current tariff is going to be about 20% higher than that and 31% higher than what Pakistan is looking at. So none of this really makes sense why India is being punished. But is it a negotiating tactic? Perhaps it is. What does President Trump think he's got to gain from India? I don't know. Perhaps there's something happening there. But it seems like this photo op was all sorts of people trying to signal to other parties, we're not alone, and taking it from there, really. But what it actually means in terms of substance rather than style, still not clear.
Thank you very much, Dia. Last question from me. Of course, India very recently, last spring, had its own taste of an escalating conflict with Pakistan. Can you just please remind us what happened, and also where is it at now, and what should we expect in the near future? A cooling down of tensions or possible escalation again? How do people look back on what happened in the spring?
What happened in May was what India would say that there was an attack on India's territory in Pakistan where civilians were killed. And then in the war, it went into sort of full-blown war between India and Pakistan. And again, this is a very interesting point about China there and China's capabilities in terms of arming the world. CNN was saying that because China was arming Pakistan, and Pakistan was reportedly causing serious damage to Indian weaponry, which was India was buying all that from either Russia or some of it was actually from France. But Pakistan was able to cause serious damage, reportedly, though India denies this, but according to Pakistan's reports. CNN was saying that this is a glimpse of how Chinese defense exports are reshaping regional deterrence because Pakistan was being able to do this through the use of Chinese weaponry. So that was quite interesting. So this conflict, it has already gone global in that sense, if you think about it. Where it goes from here, the summit, if you like, in China, the focus was on those three countries, but Pakistan was also there. So are we looking at some sort of diplomacy that's being conducted by Putin and Xi in bringing two of its allies at the table and trying to sort this out? I don't know. But the hostility, it's a funny one. It's a funny one, Adélie, because culturally, the two countries have so much to share. It used to be the same country not so long ago. Culturally, they share a huge amount, but the grievances still remain. The grievances are still pretty raw. And it is like a tinderbox. Anything happens, and it just blows up like that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I am South Asian myself. We've never been able to predict what's going to happen between India and Pakistan living in that region. I don't claim to be able to predict that living here. We don't know, but it's all very interesting.
Thank you so much. Dom, do you have any questions?
I do, thank you. There's a couple of quickies for me. Firstly, I've seen various reports about whether or not India is still buying oil from Russia. Have these tariffs worked to get India away from cheap Russian oil? So do you know where the current state of play is on that? And secondly, I've heard of this moniker of CRINK for this sort of axis of evil or whatever you want to call it. So China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, this increasing this sort of ecosystem of help, not natural bedfellows, but help with military export and blah, 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 blah. And I've heard India added to that. So I suppose from CRINK it goes to CRINK. China, Russia, India, Iran, North Korea. Right. So with this, the thing we saw recently in China, is that too much of a leap beyond the India-Russia or India-China relationship? Does India have a relationship with Iran, India with North Korea? Is it too fantastic to consider India as part of this axis against, quote unquote, the West anymore?
That's a very interesting question, Dom. The honest answer is I don't know the relationship between India and North Korea. That's a very interesting one. How far does that go? But does it need to have a separate relationship with North Korea?
Francis, if you're listening, Dia just said that was a very interesting question.
Oh, bless you. Does it need to have a direct relationship with North Korea if it's forging a relationship with China? Is it forging a relationship with China? I don't know. We don't know that yet. They have been seen together. And India is saying it's taking a pragmatic stance towards finding a way to cohabitate with China, which is its next door neighbour. I don't know about that. About whether it's continuing to buy oil, that's also an interesting question because India will tell you, or the people that I've been speaking to will tell you, if India stopped buying Russian crude oil, what would happen? The price of existing oil that the West is buying is going to go up. And all the inflationary sort of pressures that Western countries are feeling now are only going to get much worse because India is a huge buyer of oil. So if India enters the market as a buyer, prices of available oil goes up also. There was an interesting interview that John Bolton gave to Al Jazeera where he was saying that India hasn't violated any sanctions. It has been buying the refined oil and then, not refined oil, crude oil, then refining it and selling it back to Europe. And it has followed the G7 price cap directive, which says that there's a maximum price threshold on Russian origin oil. So even within the US machinery, John Bolton is no longer part of the government, of course. But there's a little bit confusion as to what India should be doing here, because it seems, as far as India is concerned, there's a global understanding that India will carry on buying this oil in order to stabilize the world market a little bit. But then India's being penalised for doing that. So it all seems like all sorts of communications going around from all sorts of places and maybe everybody interpreting it slightly differently. But of course, there are real consequences for real people on the ground. What are these, if the tariffs go up, how is the Indian population, which is it's a country that's growing fast economically as well, how do they cope with these tariffs? That's a very real question. All very interesting. I'm not sure I've got a definitive answer to your questions, but these are the noises that I'm hearing.
Thank you very much, Dia. And now we're going to go to final thoughts. Dom, do you want to start?
Yep, thank you. Folks, if you've got any thoughts on that, about the relationship with China, with India, be delighted to hear them. So I'm going to go back to these drones. I'm worried, actually, looking at this, NATO's response to these drones. I'm worried that NATO is about to make a very big mistake. So these drones, no pilot, no skin in the game. Does that matter? These incursions, does it matter that there's not a warm pink body involved? So when we talk about shooting them down, so does it make it more likely that you're going to shoot down a drone because you're not going to kill somebody? Or does it make it not a real military threat if you don't have skin in the game? Makes me think of two things. Firstly, today's reconnaissance might be tomorrow's strike. I don't think that whatever it was that flew over Romania the other day was armed. It was probably just doing an electronic recce, sucking up data of NATO comms, NATO radars, etc., etc. Now, it might not have had the puff on board to get any of that data back up to a satellite or get the telemetry back to Russia or occupied Ukraine. So I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised if there had been a Russian Kilo-class submarine somewhere just off the coast in the Black Sea at periscope depth to receive the data download from that drone. Maybe I'm being a little bit too Craig Thomas, read too many books, but I would not be surprised by that. I can't imagine this thing just flew around for very little purpose. But even if it did, it was not at no purpose. And that's the second thing that's got me thinking about it. Putin is a child and a bully. He will not act if the cost of his action is seen as higher than the reward. So after last week's response to the drones over Poland, of course he was going to do it again, have another go, poke a little. And after this response, again, what's to stop him? What would be making him sit now in the Kremlin and think, better not bloody try that again? He's not going to be thinking that. He's just going to be thinking, OK, look, let's do it again. Let's establish a new norm. 1 drone a week through NATO airspace becomes acceptable. 5 drones, 50. What's the new norm? The norm has to be the border is the border. And you've heard me argue many times that if NATO pushed its air defence assets up to the border with Ukraine and said, we're going to shoot anything down within 200 kilometres, which won't include a crewed jet, so no humans involved here, it's only going to be Russian drones. If they said, we're going to shoot these things down, missiles or drones, because we think they might come and pose a threat to us, that would have the unlucky benefit of also throwing an air defence umbrella over Western Ukraine. So why not do it? So what's going to be next? I see this morning report that there's 4 Russian Shadow Fleet tankers in the Baltic Sea heading west out of the St. Petersburg area where those strikes were that we reported. Now, the last time that happened, one of the tankers went to be inspected by Estonian Coast Guard, and the Russians sent a jet to go and overfly and intimidate that Estonian Coast Guard. So are we going to see something similar here? Are we now going to see Russian jets doing a sort of protection overflight of these Shadow Fleet tankers? And if they do, are they going to stray, as he did last time, are they going to stray into Estonian airspace? Are we going to move up from a few drones over Poland to a drone over Romania that has no real response whatsoever, maybe doing electronic recce? Are we now going to see crewed fighter jets over Estonian airspace again? This is what Russia does. What's going to stop him? What in his calculus is going to make him think, oh, I went a little bit too far that time, I better not do it again? So I think this is a real moment here. NATO, as I say, it's got the Baltic air policing, it's got the enhanced forward presence, it's now got Eastern Sentry. This is all great. And we're talking about tough words about actions being unacceptable. They're not going to dissuade and deter Putin. I really think this is a significant moment for NATO, and I'm quite concerned about it.
Thank you, Dom. Dia, the final thought for you. As our guest, you get to wrap up the show.
Thank you very much. I was just listening to what Dom was saying, and I completely, obviously agree with him. He's the expert on this. But it is quite interesting that if we think about from the perspective of South Asian countries, and particularly India and Pakistan, while India can't afford to lose the support of the West, and it really can't. It is engagement with the West is really crucial to all its aspirations, be it financial or developmental security. It's crucially important. Can really the West afford to lose India in this sort of battle, if you wish, because obviously these alliances are forming. This Shanghai Cooperation Organization that met in China, it includes Russia, it includes China, it's got India, Pakistan, Iran, one country that Dom mentioned earlier, is also part of this. So if these countries are forming an alliance, do you need to reach out to one partner who at times has been quite close to you, and maybe two partners, Pakistan also? How important are India and Pakistan suddenly going to become in this attempt to engage the rest of the world? That's going to be an sort of interesting question for the future, I think. And with opening up of the markets the way India has done since the 90s, really, because it used to be a closed economy. It used to be a part of the USSR bloc that we were talking about. There's an interesting opening there. You can get in there. The West can get in there. The values remain largely the same in many ways as an ex-colony, but one which has very much forged its own identity over the last few decades. It could be a very sort of important strategic partner. Is President Trump's, what should we call it, unpredictability risking losing quite an important ally in India? I think the way things stand, it's quite a difficult time for both the parties, really. Can the West afford to lose India? And can India afford to lose the West? I'm not entirely sure. It's also interesting that actually Prime Minister Modi was one of the sort of South Asian leaders who visited Ukraine and I think met with President Zelensky. So that was quite an interesting point. Xi didn't do that, but India did. So could India play quite an important role in negotiating between the two parties? Is it big enough to do that? Does it have the clout to do that? Maybe it considers itself big enough, but does the West consider it to be big enough to do that? I don't know. But these are probably questions that we're looking at in the future.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.